Thank you all for joining us today. I can't see anybody on the screen, but I will keep talking anyway. Firstly, I just want to give you a brief introduction as to what Wales for Europe is about. Hopefully, you're all familiar to the organisation for some time. I joined it shortly after a colleague of yours, Sean, put me in touch. You probably remember Sean. I think he's done since then, but it is down to one of your Green Party activists who actually pulled me into the Wales for Europe organisation on the very first day. So since then, just to reiterate what we've frequently tell people is that we are a cross-party, bipartisan. So just as I was saying, we are a cross-party organisation. We're very explicitly keen to have people from across the all parties represented in Cardiff Bay and also in Westminster. And by and large, it's succeeded to maintain a level of cohesion in spite of the differences which otherwise do occur. And it will be quite a challenge to see how we maintain that as the coming general election goes into gear. But from the very outset, our goal is to maintain the profile of Europe and the European Union in the political discussion and make sure it stays on people's radar. Plans to rejoin the European Union, that's always there. Plans to rejoin the various institutions of the European Union, that's always our goal. But ostensibly, it's about making sure that people don't forget what has happened. Don't forget the promises that were made. And don't let the political establishment on either side of the two parties forget that actually the subject is still a major subject and it's still hurting people. So with that in mind, I want to introduce to everybody who's joined us today Anthony Slaughter, who's leader of the Green Party in Wales. Anthony, I think you've been leader of the Green Party, is it possibly, am I thinking 5 years, is that correct? That's right. We caught up at the Pride event last year, and I think the year before that as well, where you had very good representation. I think it was very, very well attended, your stand was. So with that, I would like to pass over to yourself, if I may, and invite you to give your perspective on the way things are going currently. You'll probably be aware of what's happened today, which is an astonishing turn of events. I suspect nobody was expecting the arrest of Jeffrey Donaldson. I have no idea what I think or what impact this will have on the impact of Brexit in Northern Ireland. I don't think anybody knows, still digesting the astonishing news. But over to you, Anthony, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite to speak at this. It's really good to see such a mix of familiar faces and new faces, which is always a good bonus. And yeah, I've only just picked up on the news from Northern Ireland. Yeah, not quite sure how that plays out just yet. Just briefly to introduce myself first, for those of you who don't know me, as mentioned, I'm leader of the Green Party in Wales. Have been, this is my second term since being first elected in 2019. I did serve 2 terms as deputy leader back in 2014, 2015. Been involved with the Green Party as an active member in terms of standing for elections and campaigning for about 12 years now. A very rewarding 12 years. And I've also been, I was asked just to give some background, my involvement with the pro-European movement. I've been involved at a local level and national level since the very beginning, really. My first entry point into the pro-European movement was probably a Cardiff for Europe meeting, and then getting involved with Wales for Europe, and together with Sally Stevenson from Cowbridge, setting up the Vale for Europe group. So over those years, over those many years of campaigning we were all involved in, I didn't attend all, but probably almost all events at a local level here in Cardiff and Penarth, and also all the very big inspiring rallies and marches in London. I also got to stand as the leaderless candidate for the Greens in Wales in the unexpected European election in 2019 that we weren't expecting to take part in, which was really, really bittersweet for the Greens. And we got 7 Green MEPs elected from England, knowing that they only had a few months to do what they could do there. It was a really, for us, a really good reminder of what we were about to lose and what we have since lost. The current perspective on it now, I mean, we had a strange period because COVID sort of put everything on hold, so you couldn't quite tell what was caused by what. But I think it's apparent to everyone across the political spectrum over the last few years, the effects of Brexit are hitting home. They're hitting industry, they're hitting agriculture, they're hitting consumers, they're hitting travellers, they're hitting students. It's becoming undeniable. Even the most avid pro-Brexit people don't pretend it's a good thing anymore. And one of the things that shocked me and worried me deeply, as someone who believes in as much devolution for Wales and up to independence, is the way Brexit was used, funny enough to coin a phrase, to take back control. We've seen a concentrated post-Brexit Westminster power grab, taking back, now they've got outside of the EU regulations, taking back powers and legislation from the devolved nations, with the internal markets bill levelling down, the shared prosperity fund taking control over the money. And we never forget that, I really like the fact that you said that, Harry, never forget that we were told no one would lose a pound. All European funding would be matched. The shared prosperity fund clearly doesn't do that, but it also takes away that European money that was controlled, spent, decided by the Welsh government, is now decided by Westminster. And just purely coincidentally, they seem to be spending a lot of that in Conservative marginals. And it's this thing that, it only just hit me earlier on walking back to it, because that phrase we heard so much, take back control. And they meant it, but not in the way that they sold it to the public. And I've had concrete examples of this. I was in London recently for a press conference of all the UK Green Party's leaders and having a good chat with Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvey from the Scottish Greens afterwards. And Lorna is fuming. Lorna had put into place, as a member of the Scottish government, the bottle deposit return scheme was set to be introduced in Scotland. It was set to be up and running by August this year. The UK government stepped in and said, you can't do that under the internal markets bill. You've got to go with our standard and the bottle deposit return scheme that we're going to introduce. The best possible estimate is that will be in place in 2028. And it's just an example. In the Scottish government, again, the Greens and SNP had their Gender Recognition Reform Act, Westminster coming in saying, you can't do that. So it's a deep worry for me, outside of all the obvious damage that Brexit is causing, that the Westminster establishment are using it to claw back power and reverse devolution. I had another good example of this morning, of the impact of Brexit, speaking to real people. I had a meeting with Abu Reader, who is the Deputy President of NFU Cymru. And you'll all be aware there's lots of debate and controversy going on between the Welsh Government and the agricultural sector. And again, it's something that if we hadn't left the EU, the Welsh Government wouldn't be in this predicament of trying to fix this problem that they don't have the resources to fix. But it also struck me that it's an ironic example because we had the people, we're all familiar with the left-wing argument against Brexit, and in our movement, some people would argue that leaving the EU was an opportunity for us to have better environmental laws because the farm payment scheme under the Common Agricultural Policy was deeply, deeply flawed. Whereas I would argue that we need to stay, as I think everyone in this room would, we needed to stay in the EU to reform that. But it was an opportunity when this is what Michael Gove promised us, we could do things differently. But we haven't. The farmers, the agriculture sector are really, really hurting now. And not just on this uncertainty over what replaces the farm payment scheme. I was quite shocked to hear this morning speaking about the organic sector in the UK. They are in massive decline because so many of our small organic producers depended on EU exports, exporting their specialty produce. And I was told this morning that the paperwork, the bureaucracy, it is just not worth being in business anymore. So none of this is a surprise to us. We all knew this was coming. We told people this was coming. And then again, speaking as a Green, the environmental standards, which we flagged up over and over again, that this would be a race to the bottom. This wouldn't be an opportunity for Britain to have higher environmental standards. Again, with the overlap of the agricultural sector, there's been some pushback against the farmers who are unhappy about some elements of the sustainable farming scheme, saying, well, you don't sell your meat in Wales, in the UK. Only 5% of it gets sold in Wales. But they're competing against a deregulated market, lots of made up, supposedly amazing free trade deals that have helped outside farmers, outside agricultural business, undercut Welsh farmers, English farmers, and export inferior products into the UK. So it's all these things that highlight how we knew this was going to happen. And interestingly, just while I'm on the agriculture subject, one of the things that's been very, very interesting for me recently is because we tread a fine line on the agricultural issue because reform is needed. There are things that need to happen, but you do need to take the sector with you. But what's been interesting in the pushback, and it's been very worrying to see the farmers' genuine concerns being hijacked by what we call the alternative right, the alt-right, blaming it all on the net zero agenda. And what was interesting to me, the same people, Farage, Tufton Street Mob, all the people making this spurious claims about net zero is another way to control, are the same people who use Europe as the bogeyman. So Europe is the bogeyman, then vaccines are the bogeyman, and now net zero is the bogeyman. So it does show what was behind, as we always knew, what was behind this vulture capitalism, opening up markets. We could have a whole separate meeting going into the ins and outs of free ports and how they're being used to cynically fill the gap that's been caused by leaving the EU. So I think it all plays into a very, very toxic narrative. And I think one of the things I took the most from all the Wales for Europe and the Cardiff for Europe and Bale for Europe campaigning was what an incredibly positive campaign it was. And I think a lot, like a lot of other people, I learned a lot about how to actually engage meaningfully with the public. The famous Brexitometers and all those conversations we had. And so what we need to do now as we move into a general election as a movement is examine, analyze what is the best way for taking that forward. So we're unambiguously, and absolutely this is a cross-party movement, we're not the only party that's saying this, but we are unambiguously for rejoining the EU when the time is right, when the situation allows it. I was in a conversation with someone else the other day, a left-wing Labour person, and talking about this, and they said, can you imagine if the UK wants to try to rejoin the EU at the moment? We've got a government that's about to embark on an illegal, flouted international law with the Rwanda scheme, an economy in car crash thanks to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, and a government that wants to leave the ECHR. So we've got to do some very serious thinking about how we strengthen those bonds. So I think my own personal take is we will go into this general election with that in our manifesto, that we believe that the UK should rejoin the EU at the earliest possible opportunity. But at the same time, that isn't a single issue campaign. We must campaign across all parties for as much integration as possible, closer relationships with our European neighbours. Our policy is for rejoining the customs union as a first start. That really should happen. We would like to see freedom of movement restored. The Erasmus project, rejoining Erasmus is a no-brainer. That was just a pure act of pure spite from the Brexiteers to take that opportunity away from so many people. So I think the general election, it's an interesting opportunity, talking to other campaigners and interestingly talking to proportional vote campaigners, Make Votes Matter campaign and others. There's a wariness to bring too many of these issues to the general election campaign, which I think is a mistake. But I understand why people are, there's a desperate need, and I don't think anyone in this room will disagree with me, to get rid of the Conservative government. So a lot of people who would be very, very pro-proportional representation, pro-rejoining the EU, don't want to make things awkward to the Labour Party. I think that's slightly misdirected. We need our voices to be heard. So after this election, when there is a Labour government, and as a Green Party member, I would say I hope there is a Labour government after this election, those issues have been debated, they have resonated. The incoming Labour government knows that people care about this. This isn't something to sweep under the carpet. It is inconceivable to think of a future where we aren't more closely integrated with Europe and where we aren't trying to get back into that family of nations. I think, just glancing down, I think those were the main points I wanted to make, and I was far more interested in a bit of a conversation and having some questions and feedback and discussing issues with people.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We take that around that. I'm also very glad that we have you engaging in politics in Wales and also engaging in politics nationally, so that you can pick up the contours of how the Green parties is. So, as I was saying, very grateful that we have you looking at engaging in politics in Wales and also nationally, so that we can see, so that you can see that and pick up the contours of how Brexit is being treated across the United Kingdom. I'm going to open the floor to beg your pardon, the floor to the other guests, and if you would like to ask a question, I can't actually see everybody, but Joe, I think you could do me a massive favor by drawing to my attention who's got their hand up, if you don't mind. I can see the screen. I can see the first person up is Phil, and I think I'll go to Phil actually. Phil, if you'd like to ask your question to Anthony. Thank you, Anthony, again.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because there were some comments about rejoining the EU from Peter Mandelson just a few days ago, and I think his response to the idea of joining the EU was, I think the words he used were something like "pull the other one," and he just sees it as a complete non-starter. And I'm just wondering what your views on that were.
Yeah, that was not surprising. What is surprising is having Peter Mandelson at the heart of British politics again, commenting on things. And perhaps there's a touch of guilt there. This could make the case that Peter Mandelson was one of the reasons we didn't win the argument. But I don't think it's helpful. I understand what that side of Labour are doing and why they think they're doing. But the big danger is saying what you think you need to win the election to win over certain voters, while everyone sort of holds their nose and says, it's okay, Labour's a pro-EU party, we'll do the right thing once we're elected. People like Peter Mandelson after the election will turn around and say, we don't have a mandate for that because we didn't say anything about that. So I think it's very unhelpful, and it's probably the best Peter Mandelson could do is go away and count his money.
Thank you, Anthony. I can see some grins coming across the screen very clearly. Charles, please, after you. Utina, mute Charles, by the way.
Right. I was just asking what my sound was like. Am I echoing, or is it coming
You're
over
fine.
all right?
You're good. You're good.
Okay.
Go through.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that about Mandelson. When people like him retire from active politics, they should just clear off and shut up and stay quiet, especially when you've had to resign twice on sort of moral grounds from a cabinet. Yeah, they should just go away and leave us in peace. I don't think he's got anything of interest to say about anything, actually, Mandelson. And exactly my reaction was, go away and count the money that you've got from your filthy rich friends. Anyway, don't get me started on Mandelson. Anthony, what's your advice for Wales for Europe and other For Europe organisations during the election campaign? I've got to live a double life because I've got a party political life as a Labour and cooperative local community councillor and active member, but I've also got a cross-party and no-party life as vice chair, along with as co-chair along with Porrick of Wales for Europe. So I've got to be careful with my twin identities. In my identity as a Wales for Europe person, what do you think is the best thing we can do during the general election campaign? What limited sort of actions can we take that will have some beneficial effect at least?
I think keeping it on the agenda is crucial. It's obviously not an election about this, and people want to see it as a referendum on whether we should rejoin the EU. But I think it would be a mistake to be timid about it. I think so. Things like local hustings have Wales for Europe or Cardiff for Europe. Local groups have hustings, which won't just talk about our relationship with Europe, but can focus on, and then in things like the NFU hustings. And I would be bringing up, this is my political hat on, not the Wales for Europe hat on. I think the crucial thing is to find a way of making sure it doesn't go off the agenda. And a phrase I use quite often is to be a critical friend, because again, going back to cross-party, we agree on so much that this isn't and this isn't a moment for point scoring. This isn't a moment saying, we're the party that's pro-Europe, look at you, you're betraying us. It's time to carry on. And Wales for Europe did an incredible job of that, bringing together people from across the political spectrum and working together really well. So I think it's just to reignite that and to talk on terms of what is achievable, to push for a rejoining the customs union, because we'll get so little resistance now from businesses, from agriculture. Everyone knows that that would be the sensible thing to do. So to push for that, make sure it's on the table. We hopefully have a Labour government that is then brave enough to say these things are broken and these are the ways to fix it. So I think it's down to us across all our parties just to make sure in this election that we do talk about it and that it is heard about. And we do talk about the damage that's been done. And the response to that will be, there's been COVID, there's Ukraine. They can't get away from the very, very real damage, which we predicted, we knew would happen. And they need, in some ways, they are being held to account because we will get rid of this Conservative government. But we need to make sure that the other parties, in whatever form they form the next government, are aware that this is something that matters to a lot of people in this country, in all 4 countries.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Anthony. And our next question, I don't see any hands. Is anybody interested? Oh, there we go. Edward, over to you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah, it's maybe going a little bit off the main thing, but you know, I guess as the Green Party, you're probably aware the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the fact that the UK government has got us in this situation where there's going to be a kind of year between you know, the EU implementing it and the UK implementing it. For those who aren't aware, this is the EU's sort of trading scheme in carbon credits, but I think it's probably one of the decisions behind Tata's decisions on Port Talbot, and it's again a sign of, you know, lack of preparedness by the UK government in that they're spent far more effort on trying to, you know, fly a few refugees to Rwanda, whereas they could be spending the time getting their carbon border adjustment mechanism sorted out in order to avoid having a year of, you know, uncertainty for British businesses. But it maybe, you know, from your Green perspective, I wonder if you have comments on that aspect.
Yeah, there's always some hesitation around carbon trading schemes, and they can be exploited. But you're absolutely right to point out that it is part of the ongoing dilution of environmental regulations, and it does impact businesses. And I think you're very astute to make the connection with Tata. And Tata have been quite clear, even with the money that Labour are promising them, they've been quite clear that they are going. Well, they'll be going down to the electric arc furnaces. It's just a massive act of self-harm. The UK government is. And I think what's most surprising, it's tied its own hands in all these international deals. I think what's most surprising, this is what surprised the farmers, that they weren't ready. They've been working for this for so long, talking it up for so long. They weren't actually ready to deal with the consequences of it. And they're flailing around now. And this is just another example. And we will see, and with these sort of regulations, the longer it goes on, the harder it will get to get UK back up to acceptable international standards. It's very much a race to the bottom.
Right. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks.
I'm going to weigh in here and ask a question. Some of you will be familiar with the underfunding of Wales through the HS2 consequentials, which have been denied to Wales. My own Senate member, Dawn Bowden, has frequently pointed out that even the Welsh Conservatives are calling for the HS2 consequentials. I have the impression that Welsh Labour would like to think that the issue is going away and that they've settled. I think they've abandoned any prayer of recovering the billions that are due to Wales. What is your reading of that, and connecting it back to the European Union, to matters relating to the customs union, the single market, etc.? How do you read Welsh Labour's appetite for the subject when, on something as core as HS2 consequentials, they're as mute as they are? Thanks, Anthony.
It's a strange one, isn't it? And we're entering uncharted territory, really, with probably a Welsh government in Cardiff Bay and a Welsh government in Westminster. And it's exposing tensions already. I think Keir Starmer can't say it often enough that there isn't going to be any more money. So I speak to Labour members who campaign quite strongly for HS2 different consequences to be paid, and the difference that it could make to the Welsh transport infrastructure. A Welsh government should be standing up and demanding that. And it will expose some interesting tensions between Welsh Labour in the Senate and Labour in Westminster. Another example of that is the call for the devolution in the Constitutional Commission report, the call for the immediate devolution of policing and justice to strengthen devolution. And that is Welsh Labour policy. That is something Welsh Labour have agreed. And to see Joe Stevens, Shadow Secretary for Wales, dismiss it with a smile on Politics Wales a few weeks ago, saying that's not going to happen. It's going to be an interesting time, and because it's also that thing, sort of going off Brexit, I don't spend too much time on internal Labour politics, but it's going to be the government in Wales won't be able to blame the government in the UK, or they won't want to blame the government in the UK. So it's something we've campaigned quite strongly on. It's something that's unarguable. That money is owed to Wales. Scotland have had it. Wales should have it. It would be transformative for Wales to have that money.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And our next question, would anyone like to put their hand up? I might have to pick. There we go. Phil, go ahead.
I thought I'd raise what's quite a topical issue at the moment, which is the state of the rivers. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the headlines. And I'm just wondering, in terms of how we got into this quite literal mess with the rivers, how much do you ascribe to Brexit and how much do you ascribe to other factors? I don't think it's the only thing, because for one thing, I'm aware the Environment Agency had its budget slashed in recent years, particularly when a certain somebody by the name of Liz Truss was Environment Secretary. I wonder what happened to her. So I just wondered what your reading was.
I suppose there's an overlap with sidestepping EU rules, but I think the rivers one is more an issue of ownership, and it's an issue of shareholder greed. It's an issue of, and when I talk about this in comms meetings with colleagues in England, because quite often I have to remind colleagues when we're drawing up manifestos or putting out press statements, I have to remind them that some things are different. And they sort of look back and come back to me and say, well, you're really lucky because you've got a not-for-profit water company in Wales. And we know that it is as bad, as ineffective as the companies in England. But I think that is not helped by Brexit, but I think it is more about, it's that massive privatisation push. And we do argue that water should be taken back into public hands. It is ridiculous that it's not.
Thank you, Anthony. And going out to our next question, would anybody like to raise their hands? I will ask another question in that case, in the absence of a question. Very soon, we'll all be approached on doorsteps by Labour activists. If they come to my doorstep, it'll be a waste of time because I already am a member of the party, so they shouldn't be wasting their time with me. Although I'm not very much of an activist, I can find it. What do you think is the most embarrassing thing to say to an activist from the Labour Party on a doorstep? What is the one thing that is most difficult for Labour Party to deal with as far as the European Union is concerned and the whole Brexit thing? What is the Achilles heel?
I think it's that acceptance, that sort of saying it's done and dusted, from every level in the Labour Party, just saying that it's done and dusted, we don't go back there. That absolute fear of trying to make the argument for something progressive and positive, which is where it overlaps with proportional representation. But absolute fear that you can't win an election if you talk about the good things that you think should happen. And I think that would be it. It would be saying, why aren't you making a case, not for rejoin, not for another referendum, that is obviously political suicide, but making the case for how do we improve our relationship with Europe? How do we get back some of the benefits we had and create a relationship where we can become closer again in the future? And I think it would be that. It is, and again, overlapping with PR, when the Labour membership fully support proportional representation, it's time to be bold. You know, that's the other thing that came across in the Owen Jones video online the other day. Labour aren't going to lose. You know? No one thinks they're going to lose. This is an opportunity to be bold and to shift the narrative.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. Charles, do you mind if I go to John Matthews first? Is that okay with you, Charles? Thanks. John, over to you.
Yeah, a more hypothetical question. If we were to have another referendum on the European Union, the one thing we don't want is to end up in a 50-48 situation as we did in 2016. Would you think that a 2/3 majority, or at least a 60% majority in favour of rejoining the EU, would give it greater legitimacy than what we've got at the moment?
Thanks,
I think that should probably been there from the start.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cameron didn't think he was going to lose, did he? He thought this was going to shut his party up. This was going to put the argument to bed. I'm quite worried about another referendum. It's I think, and I've had this conversation talking about independence with people in Scotland and Wales as well, and Robin McAlpine from Commonweal, pro-independence Scottish think tank, makes the case quite convincingly that referenda aren't always the way forward, because referenda make things so binary. And I think we have to get back by strengthening bonds, by showing things work, by business realizing that they were sold a lie, that they want to be back in Europe. So I think we're a way off a referendum. And it's another interesting thing that comes up in the pro-Welsh independence debate, because a lot of people, I find, support pro-Welsh independence, and in Scotland, support Scottish independence, because they want to rejoin as an independent Wales, or an independent Scotland. And I would want an independent Wales back in the EU. But Will Hayward, in his book, Could Wales Be Independent, which was very impartial, just examined the issues one by one, made a very compelling case of just how long it would take to rejoin the EU in terms of having the referendum on Welsh independence, getting that through, then Welsh. So I think we need to make the case in different ways. At some point, there has to be a public decision, and you could argue, as sort of pro-independence people in Scotland argued, is if they got a majority of pro-independence MPs, that's a license to have a referendum. But yeah, it would be even more toxic. I think if we had a referendum in the next 3 to 5 years on rejoining the EU, it would be, especially given the fallout, and the Tories are probably going to split into separate parties, with several different parties. I think to push one at the moment would just result in a very, very toxic public debate. And it would probably be the 48-52 again, whichever way that went.
Yeah, you're right, aren't you? Shame, but there we are. Thanks,
John. Thank you very much. Between Ken and Charles, I'm going to pass to Charles first. Thank you for that, Charles.
Go to Ken, Warwick.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah. Ken, welcome to the forum.
Hello. Yes, just reflecting on where the European Union is now. It's not the same as it was in 2016. Obviously, a lot depends on the European elections in June, I think it is, where there seems to be a hope by the right wingers that they get to control more of the European Parliament and the European Council. But we'll see, won't we? I just wondered, I'm a bit more cautious about identifying with Europe, but what do you feel, Anthony, about the way green progressive politics can grow in Europe?
I think it's crucial, and you're absolutely right to highlight this coming election, because that also highlights the thing when Will Hayward talks about his claim is 25 years before Wales, an independent Wales, will rejoin Europe. I think it probably could be a bit short, 10, 15 years. But yeah, we do need to remember that the EU might be a very, very different thing in 15 years' time from the EU that we left. So it is crucial, and I will be working with Green colleagues in Europe in any way I can to support their campaigns, because we need those liberal, and not just from the Green Party, we need liberal progressive voices in the European Parliament. And Terry Reinke, the German MEP, is very, very clear on this. So this isn't a threat to be taken lightly. We sort of sit in comfort and bewilderment to what's happening in America, and the fact that Trump might be re-elected again. But we do need to be very, very vigilant and aware of what could happen on our own doorstep. And again, that highlights the absolute sadness of us not being there to be part of that discussion.
Thanks, Anthony. Jason, over to you. Thank you for joining us, by the way.
Yeah, just just sort of following on from what we were saying about referendum or no referendum. I think if we go back to 2015 and we look at the thought processes on the part of the Tories that led us to have a referendum in the first place, you had UKIP, you had Farage, you had a single issue party that, for want of a better description, infiltrated politics, particularly on the Conservative side, put the fear of God into Cameron, who then buckled and called a referendum because he feared losing large amounts of support and potentially party members to the UKIP cause. Now, at the current time, everybody in this group will be aware of the various different pro-EU parties that will be fielding candidates in the next general election, whenever that may be. Is there not a case to be made that rather than having several pro-EU parties, there should be a single pro-EU party on a similar kind of basis to UKIP, and that what we should actually be pushing for is for that party to put the fear of God into the other parties and make them realise that if they don't embrace the pro-EU question, then they potentially are going to lose votes, because I can't remember the exact figures, was it 16.9 million people voted to remain in the EU. I would guess that there's still a fair proportion of those who would be prepared to cast a vote, albeit not in a referendum, for a party that would put that foremost as a single issue to exert pressure in that way.
Thank you, Jason. That's a very interesting question. Anthony, over to you with that one.
Well, we did try that, didn't we, in 2019 with the Unite to Remain campaign. And the deal between Lib Dem, Greens and Plaid, dividing seats up. And we only had one seat in Wales that I stood in, Vale of Glamorgan. And the stumbling block was Labour wouldn't sign up to it.
Yeah,
so
right.
That could have been a game changer. It's always tempting, and it's very much, as we go into this general election, talked earlier about how people are so desperate to get rid of this toxic government. There'll be a lot of pressure on people not to stand. They'll be, using a similar argument, there'll be, you've got to vote for the strongest anti-Tory candidate. And as Greens, we get this a lot. And we are standing in every seat in England and Wales this year for the first time ever this year or January next year. And it's not because we don't believe in cooperation with other parties for common goals. We do. Our door is always open. We'll always talk to people, whether it's on this issue, whether it's on fair votes, getting rid of the Tories. But people have to talk to us and to the Lib Dems, and they don't. So it was a mixed blessing. It was very inspirational. I was really surprised when Unite to Remain was first floated ahead of the last general election, and I signed up for it. Wales Green Party Council signed up for it, the Green Party, thinking it wasn't going to happen. We're never going to make this work with three parties. And there's some very, very tense negotiations, and some people still aren't talking to each other. Landed very badly in some local areas, but the three parties did pull it off and put a coherent message out there. But it didn't work with the voters. Voters are very, very suspicious of being directed to where to vote. So I think there's some scope. I think it's possibly not quite as extreme as that, but the scope for a pledge. I think Make Votes Matter might be doing something along these lines, but getting candidates to pledge that this is something they agree with and they will push for. And goes back to what I was saying about what can Wales for Europe do, is just make sure it is on the agenda, that when candidates and party leaders are being interviewed on the media, it becomes a question that they're asked about, because Wales for Europe and the pro-European movement have made such a noise about it that commentators know it matters to voters.
Okay, thank you very much. In the absence of another hand, I'm going to weigh in with a question on electoral reform. You've mentioned proportional representation, Anthony. I heard Mark Drakeford speak at Merthyr to a very, very sceptical Labour Party. I was one of 3 who voted for the electoral reform at the time, out of 30, I think. With Mr. Vaughan Gething in the seat, do you see the electoral reform continuing as per the pact with Plaid, or do you see it possibly being postponed? What do you think is the agenda there?
Well, both Vaughan and Jeremy did commit to keeping the agreement in place, even though that is only set to run till the end of this year. And they need to pass that legislation this year if we are going to have the different voting system for Senate 26. I'm fairly confident they'll keep it in place. I mean, I have my reservations. It's a step in the right direction. It's still heavily weighted against smaller parties such as us and the Lib Dems. But I think it's in the agreement, they talk about it being an interim step because they were so keen to introduce more PR. I think as people who believe in the fair voting system, that is something that we have to hold the next government, Welsh government's feet to the fire on, that this was a stepping stone to a truly proportional system. Having said that, also very excited on a personal level because it is our opportunity, and I am very, very confident that we will break through to the next Senate election, which makes that case stronger. It's what happens, what you see with Greens at elected levels. It emboldens. So we talked about the desire within the Labour Party for PR, the desire within the Labour Party for really closer integration with Europe. Getting other progressive voices into those elected chambers emboldens those people in the other parties as well to push forward this narrative, to stop the people that are saying we can't go there, we can't talk about going back to Europe again. The public don't want electoral reform. We need to demonstrate quite clearly that the public do want that.
Thank you. Can I invite anybody to, in the absence of any, Charles, go ahead, please.
Yeah, it could be that PR really is the precondition for proper movement towards rejoin. So if that's the case, then the fact that Wales is moving towards PR is a good sign. Even it's not the PR that I would want. I'm very suspicious of the closed list system. That just gives a lot of power to people at the party head offices and doesn't connect enough with the actual electorate. But I think it's a cause for optimism that Wales is going down the PR route. And also, those of us in the Labour Party couldn't help notice that the 2 candidates for First Minister were falling over themselves to, if you like, ingratiate themselves with Wales for Europe. And they were outbidding each other, really, to say how closer alignment with the EU they were. So even though we constantly get this reply or rejoinder that Wales voted for Brexit, I think there's strong evidence that Wales has got a lot of regret about that. And would you agree that there is some cause for optimism in Wales? Drakeford wasn't afraid of saying that Wales is a European country, and as long as I found marginally that Vaughan Gething was a little bit less enthusiastic than Jeremy, but Vaughan Gething has got a track record of being pro-European, hasn't he?
I think that it's definitely clearer in Wales. Welsh Labour leadership, and Mark Drakeford was spot on this issue, as on many other issues, and not afraid to say it in a way that perhaps Keir Starmer leadership want to avoid saying anything. And so again, that gives us as campaigners, taking my party political hat off, it gives us more leeway because they will need support. And I think that acknowledgement from Vaughan and Jeremy, and being keen to show their pro-EU credentials, does indicate an awareness that this matters to people, and it matters to members of their own party, and it matters to widely more just members of progressive wing of politics. So that acknowledgement that they need those people on board to move things forward is a difference and is a very positive strength of the campaign.
Thanks for that. I'm going to look at things. Oh, excuse me, Rhiannon, please, you have the floor. Wyt mute.
Okay, diolch yn fawr, Corig, a chroeso, Anthony. Welcome, I've really enjoyed listening to your answers. Could you, you're the title of the talk is Brexit, the Environment and Green Politics. And Phil has already asked you a question about, how much has Brexit affected the environment? So could you tell us a little bit more about what green politics is?
Oh, in one sentence.
Sorry.
Green politics is about fairness and equality. So we're associated with the environmental issues, quite obviously we campaign on for so long, but we are quite clear that those issues are intertwined with social justice, that the effects of the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis that we're living through are impacting on the poorest and most vulnerable the most, both here in Wales and globally. So green politics is about fairness, it's about hope, it's about equitable use of resources, it's about fairness in terms of the polluter paying. It's everyone, because quite often this has come up. I've had training sessions where we're training people to go out on the doorstep. And I had a young guy from the valley say, I'm not going to knock on the doors to talk about climate change, it won't resonate. And I said, well, of course you're not going to knock on doors and talk about climate change. You're going to knock on doors and talk about warm houses, having your house, being able to afford to heat your home, having your home insulated so you can afford to heat it, having air that you can breathe, having cheap, if not free, public transport, having healthy, nutritious, free school meals for your children. All the things that we have to do to tackle this immense existential crisis do make people's lives better. So I'm very keen that we get that message across, that this isn't just about tackling this big threat, it's actually about making everybody's lives better. And that ties in with why the Greens would always think international cooperation is the way forward, and it was an act of massive self-harm to leave the EU.
Thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate that question. That really clarified things for me as well. Very, very nice way of doing it, actually. Really impressed. Can I incite you for another question? I'm scrolling through. I don't see any more hands. I'm going to take another initiative. Sorry, there's a question just come in very usefully from Hugh and from Clinlar. If there was a referendum to rejoin, would rejoining the euro be an impediment? I think I'm paraphrasing your question, by the way. Unfortunately, it flashed across the screen, so I didn't have a chance to read it. But do you think the euro is an impediment to the UK rejoining the European Union?
It would be very much used as one by opponents of rejoining, and it does highlight something that we talked about a lot in the campaign pre-Brexit, that the deal the United Kingdom had was quite exceptional on lots of levels. And that is something which again goes back to my reluctance to be pushing urgently for a referendum, because we would be negotiating from a very, very different position. And yes, we might well be told that rejoining the EU means adopting the euro. There'll be people who think that's a good thing, people who think it's a bad thing, but it would very, very definitely be weaponized in the debate and probably have a negative impact on the outcome, I think.
Yeah, that's a very valid point indeed. It's a good point. Question from Charles.
Yeah, we keep coming back to this issue of the referendum, don't we? And we've sort of been brainwashed into the idea that a referendum would be essential before we went back in, because that referendum was actually a travesty, wasn't it? We were told we couldn't have a supermajority because it was advisory, and then as soon as there was a marginal win one way, 51.9 to 48.1, we were told that it wasn't advisory at all, and the 51.9 was upgraded to 100% basically, and we got a full-on Brexit. Of course, a referendum is an alien thing in the British Constitution. Constitutionally, all we would need in 5 or 10 years' time is a general election and the winning party having rejoin in its manifesto. Is that impossible in 5 or 10 years' time? Well, 5 or 10 years ago, it looked to me and looked to lots of people as if the Tories were going to be in power for the rest of this decade and possibly for the rest of this century. So really, nobody knows what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time. One thing I do know is that if it were the other way around, if it were 48.1 leave against 51.9 remain, the Brexit people would not have shut up about the need for an imminent new referendum. So why we are being persuaded that we've got to keep quiet, I can't quite fathom out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If it had gone the other way, it would have been like the Washington stuff in the States, where the pushback would have been so toxic. And yeah, we were told it was a non-binding referendum. But the minute they just got that over the line, I think you're right, that does highlight the danger of future referendum. And a general election in 5 years' time is just so hard to call. Where we'll be in 5 years' time, I can only imagine that we must be in a better place. We haven't had 5 years, another 5 years of Conservative government, God forbid we do. But yeah, that would very much, and again, it goes back to the purpose of the campaign and the purpose of using this general election to keep it on the agenda so that people like Mandelson are ignored when they talk about this isn't on the cards anymore, this is on the table, move on, we've got to get on with things. So I think that general election would be a very good time. Going back to what other questions have said, we'll have an idea of where the EU is then. We'll have an better idea, hopefully under Labour, about the future constitutional settlement of the United Kingdom, which will play a large role in how we want to do it. If we do have more devolution or independent nations break together, or federalism, that might be a really good opportunity to start talking about where 4 nations working together. Let's rejoin this other big family of nations working together. There might be a very positive message to sell there. We might be in a worse position, and it might be the last thing anyone has an appetite for. It'd be a much wiser person than me who decided to predict what was going to happen in 5 years' time.
Lovely. Thank you, Anthony.
You're right. The general election would be a good way of resolving it.
Right. Thank you, Anthony. We have 2 further questions. Joe, do we have time to extend this just to hear these last 2 questions?
Yeah, sure.
Fabulous. Okay, Liz, thank you for joining us, by the way. Over to you.
Nice to meet you all. I was just thinking, we're talking about going back into Europe and joining the EU again. Is there any objections within the EU community about us going back in? You know, would there be obstructions? You know, how difficult will it be?
It might well be. It might well be. But I suppose the positive take on that is it won't be this government trying to negotiate rejoining, because I can see a lot of pushback from Europe with this government, if this government in its wildest dreams ever tried to rejoin. So we'll hopefully be in a very much different place, a much fairer and more equal society going in the right direction, and hopefully the same thing will be true of the European Union then as well.
Thanks, Anthony. And one final question, Jason, over to you.
Yeah, it's kind of a question, but it's probably just me saying things. But when it's interesting when we talk about another referendum or having a referendum, because at the end of the day, I think part of what caused the problems with the one we've just had is the way that the original referendum, the first referendum, was conducted. Because ultimately we joined in 1972, 73, whenever it was, because the politicians had realised, but on both parties, but I believe it was the Conservatives, that our future as a country was going to be better inside the common market, as it was then called. And so whichever government it was elected on the basis that they were going to carry out the negotiations and get us in, which they did. They then, to satisfy the naysayers, they then held the referendum in 1973 for people to say, do you want to stay in or do you want us to leave? Now, that was being played from a very different angle, in the sense that it was fait accompli. So what people were voting on is, do we want to go through all the hassle of taking ourselves out of this at this stage, after all of that hard work and everything else that's gone in? And we voted for the government that took us in. Now, what I tend to think of is the malign figures in the latest referendum. So the example I can think of, one of them is Peter Bone, I think, and some of the others. They interpreted that first referendum, because they were involved in politics then, as basically having had a fast one pulled on them, that they were opposed to it. They weren't given the opportunity to have a say, because we went in a very democratic fashion. So what's happened this time around is we've had a very undemocratic way of ripping us out of it. So just from that point of view, I'm inclined to agree with what Anthony has been saying. I've been thinking this for a while. We really need to be in the position where we're electing a party into government who has as its core central pledge to take us back into the European Union. If they then achieve that, then at that stage, it's for them to decide whether we have a further referendum on, now we've done all this work, should we undo it again, rather than have a referendum to go in. Because I think if we do, we're going to just reopen all the old arguments, and Putin's going to be throwing his money at it, if he's still around, left, right and centre, and we'll be back to square one. But just my two penny worth for what it's worth, anyway. Thank you.
Anthony, would you like to answer that?
No, it's a really valid observation. And yeah, the money thing, the amount of money that the other side would throw at it if we went back to referendum. I do think you're just strengthening the point of view that we need to get a government elected that is quite openly pro closer integration and eventual rejoining. And then, yeah, so then any future referendum, as you point out, is saying, do we undo all this? Whereas a referendum now is saying, those 3 torturous years of negotiations, do we restart all of those? Do we, and as other people pointed out, there will be some pushback from some members of the EU as well, and there'll be different agendas. So I think we have to get to a position as United Kingdom where it's very clear that the government of the day wants this to happen. And if they've been very clear with the electorate on that, I have no problems with seeing that as a mandate to start the work of rejoining.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us this evening. My name is Borg O'Brien, as you can see, the Deputy Chair, along with Charles. The two of us are both recruiting, searching very, very hard for a full-time single chair. I have made it clear that I will be standing in this position until the polls close on election night, whenever that happens. Please do feel free to get more involved with our movement. And if you're not already a member, please do join us and join our events, because we do try to hold as many events as possible to keep the subject on the radar. We encourage people to be argumentative and to be awkward, and to ask questions that people do not want to hear the answers to, and just keep putting those questions in front of people. Keep the subject on the radar, if you don't mind. Anthony, I want to thank you very much for joining us this evening, and especially to Joe for having organised this. I always have to say a special word of thanks to organisers, because organisers do stuff that I can't do. And a special word of thanks to Joe, and also to Charles, and to the other questioners who placed questions this evening. I think we're good to go. Thank you, all of you, for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you soon again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.